This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Education Week's annual Quality Counts report is out, grading the nation and ranking the states on student achievement and school performance. Here to discuss the findings are Assistant Director Sterling Lloyd. Welcome back, Sterling.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by reporter Daarel Burnette. Daarel, great to have you here as well.
Great to be here.
Sterling, let's start with you. The annual report looks at academic indicators, school finance, and something that Ed Week calls the chance of success indicator. That's unique to you. Why don't you walk us through it?
Sure. It's a proprietary custom index. The Chance for Success Index uses a cradle-to-career perspective to examine the role of education in promoting outcomes throughout an individual's lifetime. The 13 indicators that make up the index capture opportunities for children to get off to a good start, move smoothly through K-12 education, and ultimately achieve positive educational and workforce outcomes as adults.
Sterling, let's start with the nation's grade. How are we faring?
The nation's educational performance earns a grade of C from Quality Counts 2018. It's a 22nd annual report card issued by the Education Week Research Center. Throughout its history, the nation's grade has ranged between C+ and C-, so it's always been fairly mediocre. The nation's score of 74.5 this year is about the same as last year, when it posted a 74.2, also a C. Anyone who's taken home a C report card will know that it typically isn't a reason to jump up and down in celebration. And in this case, it reflects a mix of strengths and weaknesses, along with some substantial disparities in the performance of high and low performing states. Nationally, high school graduation and post-secondary participation rates are up, but schools continue to struggle with wide achievement and funding gaps.
What we notice when we look at these state-by-state results, and I want to point out that there's a great map on the website for anyone who wants to go take a look at edweek.org and see where their state lines up. And we see some familiar patterns year after year. Let's talk about some of the high-achieving states. Massachusetts, once again, is at the very top.
That's right. Massachusetts leads the nation with the only B+, followed by New Jersey and some other states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. Massachusetts always performs well across the board. It does well in academic achievement, but also in early foundations that help children get off to a good start early in life.
Is it time, maybe, Sterling, after all these years, to invoke some kind of mercy rule and just take Massachusetts out of the running and give another state a chance? What do you think?
Well, some of the other states would love that, but no state gets an A. So I think there's room for Massachusetts to improve. And I would like to see all the states take a shot at that A.
But what I think is interesting about Massachusetts is what you mentioned, that there is sort of a consistent level of interest and investment in children's lives, really beginning with early childhood education, which we know from the research can make a big difference in how children start off in school. What are some states that you think made some good gains this year in the report?
Well, states that made gains include California, North Dakota, Mississippi, and Oregon. Those states all made gains of a point or more. Mississippi fares well in preschool enrollment. California really had gains fueled by improvements in school finance, per pupil expenditures, for example.
Looking at Education Week's interactive map, I can see that Minnesota, which had a B- grade, fared better than the surrounding states, particularly in the Great Lakes region, which ranged from a C- up to a C+. Sterling, what is Minnesota doing right?
Minnesota squeezed into the top 10 on our report card. It's the highest ranking state from the Midwest. States with the overall top grades generally have higher family income levels and are often nestled in more affluent regions of the country, most commonly the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. Minnesota's strength is really found in our Chance for Success Index, where it receives a B+ and ranks 5th in the nation. On that index, it fares particularly well with respect to educational foundations in early childhood. It ranks 6th in family income and 2nd in parent education. Those factors are really important in helping children get off to a good start and to enter K-12 education ready to learn and succeed in school.
Finishing in the very last spot, unfortunately, was Nevada, and it had a D- grade, but numerically it got the lowest score. The state's education leaders, including the state superintendent, have been pushing back a little bit on this and saying the data doesn't reflect more recent investments in public schools and that they expect their ranking to climb up in the next year or so. A couple questions related to that. Talk to us about how Education Week gathers the data that it uses and how fresh it is.
We analyze federal data, and there is sometimes a time lag with that data. We use the most recent information available on a national basis. So, for example, our school finance information is from 2015. And I know there in Nevada, the governor has push for some funding increases that are more recent. And so perhaps those will be reflected on future report cards.
Daarel, the top achieving states in this year's ranking, we've mentioned Massachusetts. That was followed by New Jersey, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. What do these states have in common?
What I found was a couple of things. One is a coherent state government infrastructure so that it's clear to the public who's in charge. We also found that parents had clear vehicles as to invoking change when they were upset about what's happening in their schools. One of the big things is stable leadership. So, for example, you pointed out Minnesota. Minnesota happens to have Brenda Casilius, one of the longest-serving state superintendents in the country. Same with Massachusetts. It's just stable, long-term policies that has just over the time gotten funding, gotten community support, et cetera. And then the other thing I would point out, too, is just strong pre-K programs. I was really intrigued with it's one thing for a state to have pre-K. It's another thing for states to have training for pre-K instructors, pre-K standards, curriculum. I think I pointed out New Hampshire that actually has a program for students who perform in the 49th percentile that aren't clearly prepared for kindergarten. So it's just really comprehensive policies and infrastructure that kind of helps these programs along.
Again, I'm hearing this consistent theme about early childhood education and states that are making that investment. And of course, it takes time for those things to pay off. Is some of this, Daarel, about states just having more patience?
So one of the things that I've been intrigued about as a state policy reporter since I've started working here is just the stability of state superintendents and leadership at the legislative level when it comes to education policy. This turnover has become more and more frequent, and I think this has a lot to do with how mainstream education politics has become in recent years. Most people know about Common Core. Most people know about No Child Left Behind. There's like household words. And I think because education politics is so fraught, a lot of these state leaders are just under a lot of political fire. And they resign in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I covered a state chief in Colorado who resigned after 4 months. So there's just no way for policy to be implemented and then actually see what's going right, what's going wrong. Researchers say it usually takes around 5 years. So to have state chiefs average tenure at 2 years, and for these new governors, these new state politicians to come in and they want to start from scratch, they want to implement their new policy. Everybody has an idea as to how to fix education. But eventually you have to say, okay, this is what we've decided, this is our goal, and we're going to stick to it. So yes, patience is a commodity here.
Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, at a recent speech at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, said that federal interventions in local education haven't worked. How much of the recommended steps for improvements in public schools really rely on the feds, either for authorization or funding or other legislative action and support?
The vast majority of schools actually in America are funded by state governments. So I think in the near future, you're going to see a lot more action from state leaders dictating law. They've always said, we pay for this, we should determine what happens in schools. But at the same time, in recent years, the ESEA, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, has actually dictated a lot of what's happened at schools because accountability systems are such a fundamental part of what happens on a day-to-day basis. Betsy DeVos has actually pulled something that a lot of policymakers pull. This is a move that I think has been, you see more and more frequently since the busing movement in the 80s, which is just a lot of politicians don't want to be blamed. And so they say, I don't know what the answer is. This is not my role to fix it. Let's have somebody else do this job. Most other Western governments have a centralized form of oversight over education policies. School boards is an American invention. So the fact that we allow for such local control over education policies is just something that's very unique to America.
We're talking about Education Week's new Quality Counts reports. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Sterling, I'd like to turn back to you for a moment. There is a departure here in this year's Quality Counts report, which is that you've pushed it out separately, the nationwide and state level data, and you're going to be following up with some in-depth stories later in the year. Why the change in the format?
Well, as always, Quality Counts report card grades states on their education performance. However, as you mentioned, 2018 also ushers in a new approach to packaging and releasing the report. Unlike past years when Quality Counts was released as a single annual publication, the report's data will now be released in 3 separate installments throughout the year. The goal of this change is to provide greater value for the K-12 field by allowing the opportunity for deeper analysis of the data.
We know that the graduation rate formulas used by states have become more consistent in the past 10 years or so. Is there another area where states have improved the consistency of their data collection, maybe making Education Week's annual report more reliable in terms of comparisons?
Well, our report card is based on an analysis of data from a variety of federal sources. The U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Department of Education, for example. We use test scores, data on spending in schools, and other indicators. Those metrics have typically allowed reliable comparisons over the years. High school graduation rates are really unique and have a unique history in terms of measurement challenges. In the past, states used a variety of methods to calculate rates, and the formulas in some states tended to inflate graduation rates by including GED recipients or by including counts of dropouts that were widely considered to be unreliable. We really haven't seen those types of problems with other metrics that we use.
We're now officially in the ESSA era, which means that responsibility for holding schools accountable for student achievement has been handed back to the states. Daarel, what do we know about those state plans, and how do they line up with what Education Week has found to be areas that need improvement?
One of the biggest changes, I will say, is just really that states are in charge. So there was just a lot more flexibility that state chiefs had in designing their plans. Now, what I can't say is that, at least in this round of plans, states didn't get super creative the way that I think a lot of people were anticipating. But what I do think is going to be different is the policymakers are a lot closer to the parents who are being affected by these policies. So what I think is going to be different in the years ahead is it's not necessarily going to be what is actually in the plans that matter. I think the implementation is going to be what matters at the end of the day. A lot of these state departments are struggling with staff, they're struggling with money, they're struggling with leadership turnover, and their ability to effectively support these new initiatives, such as tracking student absenteeism, or some people want to do some personalized learning initiatives, et cetera. That's going to matter greatly and more than ever. This is one of the biggest pitfalls of No Child Left Behind, and that the government tasked these state departments with executing a plan that was not theirs, and when it fell apart, the State Department just said, this is not our fault, this is the federal government's fault.
And the buck is really going to stop with the state, isn't it?
It really will. And coincidentally, when Betsy DeVos was saying, I'm not to blame, I was actually writing a story about California's governor who said the exact same thing. I'm not to blame. So, I mean, somebody at the end of the day is going to have to hold the baton here. And I think this is one of the things that's just unique about America. You know, our leadership doesn't want to take responsibility for education policies. One of the researchers I talked to for this report, she said, I'm relying on Education Week because Quality Counts is one of the few rankings that people actually trust. I just think as these states are designing their report cards, as they're designing the new standards, giving these new initiatives, fancy names, et cetera, it's going to be incumbent upon us as reporters to hold them accountable. It's going to be incumbent upon parents. This is going to have to be the public's initiative to say, we want change.
Yeah, and just to pick up on what Daarel was saying there, you know, the new latitude that ESSA allows states could narrow disparities over time. It could also widen them. So that's really why it remains important to monitor state performance. It's really critical to have an independent check for accountability purposes, and that's the value of Quality Counts as a report card. That's the value that's it's had over time, and I think it will continue to have going forward.
Well, I'll admit, from my beat reporter days, I used to love when that big, heavy FedEx envelope would be dropped on my desk with the new Quality Counts, because it meant that I had story fodder for weeks.
Right.
Daarel, tell us a couple of story ideas for local reporters who want to use the Ed Week data.
In the coming years, I expect a lot more activity from governors, legislatures, and state departments of education. I think education reporters, local education reporters, can just start checking in on these videos. I mean, these state boards of education and these House committees and Senate committees, they record their sessions. watch these sessions, look for story ideas, look for the policies that are coming down. Even if local reporters did not cover the development of their ESSA plan, I mean, most of those policies are in print now. It's likely that Betsy DeVos is going to pass a lot of these plans, et cetera. The implementation is going to be key. One of the things that's happening right now is that state departments are actually designing their report cards. They're going to try to beat out great schools and legitimize their accountability system, legitimize their report cards. I really do think that reporters could start looking at some of these battles between the state and local officials, start scrutinizing the effectiveness of their state departments of education, start looking at the leadership. The governors in the coming months are going to be rolling out long-term education plans. This is going to be a huge part of this year's elections, in which 3/4 of state legislatures are up for election. I think it's 36 governors that are up for election. Look at their education agenda. What are they saying about the state of their schools? This matters greatly.
Daarel Burnette and Sterling Lloyd of Education Week, thanks for being here and making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you'd like to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to improve the quality of education journalism and strengthen the community of education journalists. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, everybody, and thanks for listening.